Right now, at this very moment, millions of American families are being systematically priced out of the housing market. Not because they don't work hard enough, not because they're irresponsible with money, but because a perfect storm of corporate greed, policy failures, and economic manipulation has turned the American dream of home ownership into an impossible fantasy for an entire generation. This isn't happening in some distant future. This is happening today. In every city, every suburb, every small town across this country. And if you think it doesn't affect you, you're wrong. Because when the foundation of middle-class wealth building collapses, the entire economy comes down with it. I'm bringing you the truth that mainstream media won't touch. And this is US Economy Today, the channel where we don't wait for permission to tell you what's really happening to your future. If you're watching this because you've been trying to save for a house and it feels like the goalpost keeps moving further away, you need to hear this. If you know someone in their 20s or 30s who's given up on ever owning a home, share this video with them right now. And here's what I need from you. Hit that subscribe button immediately because YouTube's algorithm is actively suppressing this kind of content. They don't want you connecting the dots. Smash that like button so we can reach more people before this information gets buried. And drop a comment telling me this. What year did you buy your first home? Or if you haven't yet, what's the biggest barrier stopping you? I want to map this crisis in real time with real people, and your story matters. Share this video everywhere, because what I'm about to show you is the blueprint for how an entire generation is being locked out of wealth building, and it's accelerating faster than anyone realizes. Here's what's really happening. The American housing market has become a rigged game where ordinary families are competing against Wall Street hedge funds, private equity firms, and foreign investment pools with unlimited capital. These institutional investors are buying up single-family homes at a pace that has never been seen before in American history. They're paying cash, they're bidding above asking price, and they're converting entire neighborhoods from owner-occupied communities into rental extraction zones. And this isn't some conspiracy theory. This is documented fact with numbers that should terrify every American who cares about economic mobility. Let me take you back to where this started because you need to understand the timeline. After the 2008 financial crisis, when millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure, Wall Street saw an opportunity. Companies like Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and American Homes for Rent began buying up foreclosed properties by the tens of thousands. At first, it seemed like a reasonable investment strategy. Distressed properties needed buyers, and these companies had capital. But what started as opportunistic buying during a crisis has morphed into a systematic acquisition machine that's fundamentally reshaping American housing. By 2012, institutional investors owned roughly 120,000 single-family rental homes nationwide. That number seemed significant at the time, but it was just the beginning. By 2018, that number had grown to 300,000. And here's where it gets truly alarming. Between 2020 and 2024, during and after the pandemic, institutional ownership of single-family homes exploded. As of right now, institutional investors own an estimated 2 million single-family homes across the United States. Let that number sink in. 2 million homes that could be owned by families, building equity, creating generational wealth, stabilizing communities. Instead, they're owned by faceless corporations whose only goal is extracting maximum rent from people who can't afford to buy. But the raw numbers only tell part of the story. What matters more is the concentration and the impact on specific markets. In cities like Phoenix, Atlanta, Charlotte, Jacksonville, and Las Vegas, institutional investors now own between 15 and 25% of all single-family rental homes. In some neighborhoods, that percentage climbs above 40%. Imagine trying to buy a house in a neighborhood where nearly half the homes are owned by investment firms that will never sell. You're not just competing with other families anymore. You're competing with algorithms, with billion-dollar funds, with investors who don't care about overpaying because they're playing a long-term extraction game that you can't win. Let's talk about how this works on the ground, because this is where the human impact becomes crystal clear. Take Sarah Mitchell, a nurse in Atlanta. She's been saving for a down payment for 4 years. She and her husband have good credit, stable jobs, and $70,000 saved. In 2021, they started seriously looking for homes. They found a 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood, listed for $320,000. They put in an offer at asking price. Within 24 hours, they were outbid by an investor who paid $360,000 in cash, no inspection, no contingencies, closed in 10 days. Sarah tried again with another house. Same result. Cash offer, above asking, investor buyer. Over the next 18 months, she and her husband put in offers on 14 different homes. They lost every single one to investor buyers. Eventually, they gave up. That $70,000 they saved, it's still sitting in a savings account, losing value to inflation, while they pay $1,800 a month in rent to a property management company owned by a private equity firm. Sarah told me something that should haunt every policymaker in this country. She said, "I did everything right. I went to school. I worked through the pandemic. I saved. And it didn't matter. The system isn't designed for people like me anymore." Or consider Marcus Johnson, a teacher in Phoenix. He's been renting the same house for 6 years. The house was originally owned by a local family who sold it in 2020 to an investment company. Since then, his rent has increased every single year. It started at $1,400 a month. Now it's $2,300. That's a 64% increase in 6 years. His salary as a teacher has gone up by 11% in that same period. Do the math. He's being priced out of the house he's lived in for 6 years, and he can't buy a comparable home in the same area because investors have bought up most of the inventory and driven prices beyond what his teacher salary can support. He's looking at moving an hour outside the city, away from his job, away from his community, just to find something affordable. And even that's becoming impossible. Now let's talk about why this is happening and why it's accelerating. Institutional investors have several massive advantages over individual buyers that make competition fundamentally unfair. First, they pay cash. No mortgage contingencies, no appraisal issues, no financing delays. In a hot market, cash is king, and sellers almost always choose the certainty of a cash offer over a financed buyer, even if the financed offer is slightly higher. Second, they can afford to overbid because they're not thinking about one house. They're building a portfolio. If they overpay by $20,000 on a house that will generate $50,000 in rent over 5 years, that's still a profitable investment. Individual buyers can't think that way. They're stretching every dollar just to afford the down payment. Third, institutional investors have access to capital at rates individual buyers can never get. They're borrowing hundreds of millions or even billions at institutional rates that are significantly lower than consumer mortgage rates. That gap gives them an enormous cost advantage. Fourth, they operate at scale with professional acquisition teams, data analytics, and automated bidding systems. They can identify undervalued properties, move faster than individual buyers, and outmaneuver local families who are just trying to find a place to live. And here's what makes this even worse. These investors aren't interested in home ownership. They're interested in cash flow and asset appreciation. They buy homes, make minimal improvements, and rent them out at whatever the market will bear. And because they control such a large portion of inventory in certain markets, they effectively set the rental rates. It's not a free market when a handful of companies own 20% of the rental stock. That's market control, and the data proves it. In markets with high institutional investor concentration, rental prices have increased significantly faster than in markets with lower concentration. It's basic economics. Reduce supply, control pricing, extract maximum value. Families suffer, but investors profit. Let's talk about the policy failure, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened because lawmakers at every level, federal, state, and local, either ignored the warning signs or actively enabled the problem. After 2008, there was an opportunity to implement policies that would have prioritized home ownership over investment speculation. Other countries did exactly that. Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, they all put restrictions on foreign investment and institutional buying of residential properties. The United States did almost nothing. In fact, in many ways, policy actually made the problem worse. Tax policies favor real estate investment. Investors can deduct mortgage interest, depreciation, property management costs, and maintenance expenses. These tax advantages make real estate one of the most profitable investments available, especially at scale. Meanwhile, individual homeowners get a mortgage interest deduction that's been capped and phased out for higher earners. The tax code literally incentivizes investment buying over owner occupancy. Zoning laws and building restrictions have choked off new housing supply in the exact markets where demand is highest. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Boston, restrictive zoning makes it nearly impossible to build new housing quickly enough to meet demand. When supply can't keep up with demand, prices rise. And who benefits from rising prices? Investors who already own the properties. Existing homeowners who vote against new development to protect their property values are inadvertently helping investors lock out the next generation. Then there's the complete absence of regulations on institutional buying. There are no caps, no restrictions, no limits on how many single-family homes one company can own in a given market. A hedge fund can buy 1,000 homes in Atlanta and there's nothing stopping them. Some states have proposed legislation to limit or tax institutional purchases, but almost all of those efforts have been killed by lobbying. The real estate investment industry spends millions on lobbying every year to make sure no regulations get passed that would limit their ability to buy. And where has the federal government been on this? Silent. The Federal Reserve's response to the pandemic included massive monetary stimulus that flooded the economy with cheap money. That cheap money flowed directly into asset purchases, including real estate. Institutional investors took advantage of near-zero interest rates to borrow enormous sums and deploy them into housing. The Fed didn't step in to limit that. They didn't issue guidance. They didn't raise concerns. They just kept pumping money into the system while watching housing prices skyrocket. And now, even as they've raised interest rates to fight inflation, the damage is done. Investors locked in low-rate financing years ago, and they're sitting on appreciated assets. Meanwhile, individual buyers are facing 7% mortgage rates that make monthly payments unaffordable, even if they could win a bidding war. Let's talk about what happens next, because this trajectory is unsustainable, and the consequences are severe. If current trends continue, home ownership rates in the United States will fall to levels not seen since the Great Depression. We're already seeing it. The home ownership rate for Americans under 35 has dropped to 39%. That's the lowest in recorded history. For millennials, many of whom are now in their 30s and 40s, the window for building wealth through home ownership is closing. And when an entire generation is locked out of the primary wealth-building tool in American society, you create a permanent economic underclass. Home ownership has historically been the way working and middle-class families build equity, create financial security, and pass wealth to the next generation. Without it, economic mobility dies. There's also a social cost that people aren't talking about enough. Home ownership creates stability. Families who own homes stay in communities longer, invest in local schools, participate in civic life, and build social connections. Renters, especially renters who are being displaced every few years by rising rents, can't do that. You end up with transient communities, declining civic engagement, and the erosion of the social fabric that makes neighborhoods function. Children in renter households move more frequently, which disrupts their education and social development. And when entire neighborhoods flip from owner-occupied to investor-owned rentals, you see declining property maintenance, rising crime, and community deterioration. Investors don't care about the neighborhood, they care about cash flow. And once the neighborhood starts to decline, they move on to the next market and repeat the cycle. Here's the part that should make you angry. The people making these decisions, the executives at Blackstone, the policymakers who refuse to regulate, the local officials who block new housing, none of them will ever face the consequences of this crisis. They own multiple homes. They have generational wealth. Their children will inherit property. Meanwhile, working Americans are being told to just work harder, save more, be more responsible, as if personal responsibility can overcome a system that's rigged against them from the start. It's insulting and it's a lie. So what can actually be done? Because I'm not here just to tell you the problem. I'm here to tell you what needs to happen and what you can do about it. First, we need immediate federal legislation to restrict institutional investment in single-family homes. That means caps on how many homes one entity can own in a market, taxes on bulk purchases by investors, and requirements that a certain percentage of housing stock remain available for owner-occupants. Countries like Canada have already done this. It works. Second, we need zoning reform at the local level to allow more housing construction. That means overriding NIMBY opposition, streamlining permits, and incentivizing developers to build starter homes that working families can actually afford. Third, we need tax reform that stops rewarding speculation and starts rewarding ownership. That could mean eliminating or reducing tax benefits for investors while expanding benefits for first-time home buyers. Fourth, we need the Federal Reserve and Treasury to acknowledge that housing is a national crisis and treat it as such, with targeted policy interventions that prioritize home ownership over asset speculation. But here's the reality. None of that will happen without pressure. Politicians respond to voters, and right now, the loudest voices on housing policy are developers, investors, and existing homeowners who benefit from rising prices. If you want change, you have to get loud. Contact your representatives. Show up at city council meetings. Vote for candidates who make housing affordability a priority. Join or support organizations that are fighting for housing reform. And most importantly, talk about this. Share this video. Have conversations with your family, your friends, your co-workers. Make this a kitchen table issue that politicians can't ignore. Let me be very clear about something. This is not about demonizing people who rent out properties or who invest in real estate. Individual landlords who own 1 or 2 rental properties are not the problem. The problem is the financialization of housing at a scale that treats homes as purely investment vehicles rather than places where people live and build lives. The problem is a system that allows unlimited capital to compete against working families and then act surprised when working families lose. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. We are creating a generation that will never experience the stability, security, and wealth building that home ownership provides. That generation will be poorer than their parents. They will have less economic mobility. They will be more vulnerable to economic shocks. And when you have an entire generation locked out of the middle class, you don't just have an economic problem. You have a social and political crisis waiting to explode. History is very clear about what happens when large portions of the population feel like the system is rigged against them, and like hard work doesn't lead to success. You get instability, you get unrest, you get the collapse of the social contract. So here's what I need you to understand as we close this out. The housing crisis is not an accident. It's not bad luck. It's not just market forces. It is the result of deliberate policy choices and regulatory failures that have prioritized investor profits over family stability. And it will continue until enough people demand change. This is US Economy Today, and we're going to keep covering this story, keep following the money, keep asking the hard questions, and keep holding the people in power accountable. but we can't do it without you. Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Like this video and share it with everyone you know who's struggling with housing costs or who cares about the future of this country. Drop your story in the comments. Tell me where you live, what you're seeing, what barriers you're facing. Let's build a record of what's happening in real time. And if you're angry about this, good. Channel that anger into action. Because the only way this changes is if we force it to change. The system won't fix itself. We have to fix it.